The walkout room was silent, too silent for a courtroom. The kind of silence that didn't come from peace, but from shock. The kind that crawled under your skin and stayed there. Sundar Pichai sat alone at the defendant's table, eyes steady. Posture calm, yet inside him swirled the weight of betrayal. His lawyer, a man paid millions to represent him, had just walked out in front of the judge, jury cameras, and a room full of strangers. What began as a simple business hearing had spiraled into a full-blown legal drama. Sundar wasn't just defending a company policy anymore. He was defending his character, his values, and everything he had worked for. And now, as the echoes of the heavy oak door closing behind his former attorney faded away, Sundar was left defenseless, or so it seemed. Just minutes earlier, the court had been buzzing with quiet murmurs. Reporters whispered into tiny microphones. Fingers tapped rapidly on laptops. It wasn't every day the CEO of Google stood trial, not for fraud, not for corruption, but for something strangely personal and public. The case stemmed from a controversial internal decision Sundar had made. He had supported a low-level employee, a janitor named Raphael, who had been unfairly fired by a regional manager for violating professional image standards. Sundar, who had met Raphael during an unannounced office visit, had been deeply moved by the man's humility and work ethic. He later discovered Raphael had once saved a co-worker's life during a fire and never spoke a word about it. Instead of ignoring the incident, Sundar personally intervened and reinstated Raphael, publicly defending his dignity. But the move drew backlash. The regional manager, backed by a group of influential shareholders, sued Sundar for executive overreach and accused him of favoritism, claiming he breached protocol and caused financial losses. It was a strange case, one that exposed deep cracks in corporate systems. But what shocked everyone wasn't the case itself. It was that Sundar had insisted on handling it without his legal team filtering his words. He had told his lawyer he wanted to speak plainly, to let people see him, not the shield of his company. "You're throwing your career away for a janitor," his lawyer had whispered angrily that morning before court started. "This isn't strategy, this is suicide." And now, with all eyes on him, the lawyer's words seemed to echo in the room, louder than ever. The judge blinked slowly, her face unreadable. "Mr. Pichai," she said finally, her voice cutting through the silence, "do you wish to proceed without representation?" Sundar glanced toward the door. No one returned. He looked back at the judge and nodded. "I do." Whispers rippled through the courtroom like wind over a still pond. But then something no one expected happened. A woman stood up from the back bench. She wore a blue janitor uniform. Her hands were worn, skin darkened by years of cleaning floors no one noticed. Her eyes, however, were sharp, kind, unshaken. Her name tag read Marcela. The crowd turned as she took a step forward. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear despite its gentle tone. "If no one else will defend him." "I will," gasps. Then stunned silence again. The judge tilted her head. "And you are?" "A janitor at the Google office in San Jose," Marcela replied calmly, her eyes never leaving Sundar. "I've mopped the floors outside his office for 6 years. I've seen how he treats people when no one's looking. I've seen what others don't." The prosecutor stood, furious. "This is absurd." "Your Honor, she is not a licensed attorney. This is a courtroom, not a circus." But the judge didn't wave Marcela away. She stared at her for a long, almost uncomfortable moment. "Mrs. Torres," she said, reading from her name tag, "this isn't a trial by public opinion. We follow legal procedures here." Marcela nodded, unfazed. "I'm not asking to speak as a lawyer. I'm asking to testify, not about policies or protocols, but about the man they're trying to destroy." Before anyone could interrupt, Sundar gently stood. He didn't smile, didn't cry. He simply looked at Marcela and whispered, "Thank you." The judge raised her hand, silencing the courtroom again. "I will allow a brief testimony under one condition. It must be relevant and I must speak to the character in question. If it becomes emotional grandstanding, I will dismiss it. Marcela stepped forward. Her boots echoed softly as she approached the witness stand. Sundar sat down, folding his hands in front of him. Across from him, the prosecution's lead attorney, a sharp-tongued man in his 40s named Richard Bryant, sneered. To him, this was a joke. A janitor speaking in court. He didn't even hide his amusement, but then Marcela began to speak, and everything changed. I clean offices, she said, settling into the chair. Every day, for the past 20 years. I've worked for men who wouldn't look me in the eye, who'd throw their coffee cups on the floor and expect me to pick them up like trash. I've worked in buildings where security wouldn't let me use the same elevator as executives. She paused, letting that truth linger in the air. But the first day I saw Mr. Pichai, he asked me how my day was. I thought he was a new intern. He wore simple clothes, carried his own laptop, and smiled like he meant it. A few people chuckled softly. Not in mockery, but in recognition. Marcela went on, her voice never raising yet commanding the room. He saw me carrying a broken mop. The company didn't want to replace it. Said I could wait a few weeks. He didn't ask questions. He just told the facilities team to take care of it and asked them why I wasn't provided new tools. That same day, I had a brand new mop and gloves waiting in my locker. She turned to the judge. Maybe you think these are small things, but small things matter when you've been invisible your whole life. Her voice cracked slightly, but remained strong. They're trying to punish him for defending a man like me. Like us, people who clean the messes. People who are told we don't belong in boardrooms. But Mr. Pichai, he doesn't just talk about respect and values. He lives them. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen. Richard Bryant, the prosecutor, fidgeted in his chair. The judge leaned back, her expression unreadable again. But something had shifted. What started as a trial about overreach was now turning into something much deeper. A mirror held up to the system, to class, to prejudice, and to the forgotten power of kindness. Then the judge cleared her throat. Thank you, Mrs. Torres. We will resume with the prosecution's case after a short recess. As the courtroom began to empty, Sundar stood. Marcela walked back to her seat. They locked eyes. He didn't need to say anything. Neither did she. There was something powerful in that silence. But just as the courtroom doors opened, Richard Bryant turned to his team and whispered, "We need to dig up something on that janitor. Now. Find anything. I don't care if it's a speeding ticket. We need to bury this sympathy story before it spreads." He didn't know someone nearby had heard him, and that someone was recording. Asterisk the recording. The quiet hum of conversation filled the hallway outside. The courtroom, but inside Sundar Pichai's heart, a different kind of noise echoed. A mix of disbelief, gratitude, and deep sorrow. He stood near a wooden bench by the corridor wall, sipping water from a paper cup that trembled slightly in his hands. Behind him, reporters swarmed outside like moths drawn to the flame of drama, trying to catch even a glimpse of what had just unfolded. But Sundar wasn't thinking about the media or the spectacle. He was thinking about Marcela, a janitor. A quiet woman who had always been in the background, who no one had paid attention to, and yet, when the moment came, she didn't hesitate. When his highly paid layer walked out on him in disgust, Marcela stepped in without fear. She spoke truth from the heart, and in doing so, she lit a fire in that courtroom no one could ignore. But as Sundar stood in that hallway, still processing what just happened, another scene was playing out just a few doors down. Richard Bryant, the prosecutor who had smugly assumed this case would be a walkover, was pacing inside a small conference room. Two interns sat with laptops open, fingers flying across keys. His voice was sharp, low, but urgent. I want her background by this evening. Criminal records, debt, family members, anything we can use to paint her as unreliable or emotionally unstable. We need to turn the jury's attention back to the law, not sob stories. An intern hesitated. Sir, but she's just a janitor. We might not find anything. Richard turned sharply. Then dig deeper. People like that always have something. Poor, desperate. They've made mistakes. I want this woman discredited before court resumes tomorrow. We can't let the narrative shift. What Richard didn't know was that near the coffee station just outside the room, someone had overheard him. Not a lawyer, not a journalist, but a court staff member, Elena, a clerk who handled evidence and scheduling. She had grown up cleaning homes with her mother, and her father, now retired, had once worked security at the same company where Marcela still cleaned. She knew the language of cruelty when she heard it, and she had quietly pulled out her phone and pressed record. The audio was clear. Every word Richard said, including people like that, was captured. Elena stared at her phone screen after the recording ended, her pulse racing. She knew the rules. She wasn't supposed to get involved. But this wasn't just a legal battle now. It was personal. This was about dignity. And no one had more dignity than Marcela. The woman who once offered Elena a handkerchief and she'd cried quietly in the restroom after a hard day. Meanwhile, back in the hallway, Sundar leaned against the cool marble wall and closed his eyes. The air smelled faintly of furniture polish and ink. He had always believed that the real strength of leadership wasn't in titles or degrees, but in how you treated people who could do nothing for you. He learned that from his mother, a school teacher who used to pack extra food children. She barely knew because she sensed they came to class hungry. Sundar had kept that lesson close all his life. And now, watching the system turn on him for standing by someone unimportant, he felt both anger and clarity. He would not back down. A hand tapped his shoulder. He turned and saw Marcela, still in her janitor uniform, holding a small plastic bag with 2 bottles of water and a banana. Her face was calm but tired. "You didn't eat lunch," she said. "Thought you might need something." He took the bag gently, emotions caught in his throat. You didn't have to stand up for Raphael either," she said quietly. "But you did." Sundar smiled softly. "Thank you, Marcela. I meant what I said. You reminded me today why I started this journey." Marcela nodded and stepped aside as court officers began motioning people back in. The recess was over, but before re-entering the courtroom, Elena rushed to catch up with Sundar. "Mr. Pichai," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "I need to show you something." Sundar looked at her, surprised. "Yes?" She pulled him aside to a corner near the emergency exit door and played the recording. His eyes widened as he heard Richard's voice echo through the phone speaker. Confident and cruel. When the recording ended, Elena looked up at him. "I know this is against procedure, but if this goes public, people will see the truth. They'll understand what's happening behind the scenes." Sundar didn't speak for a moment. He looked at the phone again, then at Elena. "Are you willing to come forward with this?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I am. You understand what that could mean for your job?" She looked at him firmly. "People like me, ... People like Marcela, ... We lose either way. But at least this way we lose with honor." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You won't lose, not this time." As the courtroom reconvened, Richard stood tall, ready to resume the prosecution's case. He had no idea what was coming. The judge re-entered, gavel tapping sharply. "Court is back in session. Prosecution, you may proceed." Richard cleared his throat. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to raise a procedural objection. The previous testimony given by a non-legal party should be stricken from the record. It was emotionally manipulative and lacked legal relevance." But before he could finish, Sundar stood. "Your Honor, may I be permitted to submit a recording for the court's review? It directly pertains to the integrity of the prosecution and this trial." The judge looked surprised. "Mr. Pichai, you are not currently represented. I would advise caution." "I understand," Sundar said calmly. "But I believe this recording will speak louder than any legal document." The judge gave a slow nod. "Proceed." Elena walked to the front of the court and handed a flash drive to the bailiff. The judge inserted it into her monitor and pressed play. Richard's voice filled the courtroom. I want her background by this evening. Poor, desperate. People like that always have something ... Gasps echoed through the room. Jurors shifted in their seats. Even some of the shareholders sitting in the back looked stunned when the audio ended. The judge's eyes locked onto Richard. Mr. Bryant, is this your voice? He looked pale. That was a private conversation. Were you aware you were being recorded? No, but then he just admitted the recording is authentic. This court does not tolerate manipulation, discrimination, or personal attacks disguised as legal strategy. The room held its breath. Sundar remained still, his face calm, but his chest rose and fell with purpose. We will break for the day, the judge announced, and I will be reviewing potential sanctions. Tomorrow, we will determine if this trial can proceed under its current leadership. Court adjourned. As people filed out, Richard stormed toward the exit, reporters chasing him. His confidence shattered. Marcela walked past him, head held high. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to die outside. The sky had begun to turn orange with the setting sun. Sundar stepped onto the courthouse steps and found a small crowd waiting. People who had watched from inside. People who heard what Marcela said. What Elena recorded. They weren't holding signs or chanting slogans. But their eyes were filled with something powerful. Hope. Then a small voice rose from the crowd. Thank you, Pichai. It was a teenager, holding a broom in one hand, wearing a maintenance vest. His father stood beside him, a street cleaner. Sundar didn't speak. He simply nodded. But inside, a fire had been lit, one that would not go out. Asterisk echoes of the past. Next morning, the sky over San Francisco was painted in soft gray, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A cool breeze swept through the city, rustling leaves and newspaper pages that danced across the courthouse steps. Inside, the courtroom lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the polished wood, the high ceiling, and the rows of empty benches waiting to fill with spectators once again. Sundar Pichai sat alone in a quiet room adjacent to the courtroom, sipping black coffee from a paper cup. The bitter taste didn't bother him. He barely noticed it. What he did notice was the heaviness in the air. It wasn't just the trial that weighed on him. It was the memories it stirred, long buried under years of progress, suits, strategies, and board meetings. He thought back to his early days in America, a young man with little money, big dreams, and even bigger obstacles. He had walked the same streets as a nobody, took late-night buses to libraries, ate dollar meals, and slept in freezing apartments with broken heaters. He had been invisible too, once. And now, watching how Marcela was treated, how quickly the system had tried to silence her, reminded him of every door that had once been slammed in his face. The door opened. It was Marcela. She walked in holding a small plastic container. I brought you breakfast, she said, placing it on the table. Homemade arepas. Not fancy, but good. He looked at her, truly looked. She had deep lines on her face, the kind that only came from years of working silently. Her hands were calloused, and her nails bore the marks of cleaning chemicals. Yet her eyes were calm, strong, honest. Thank you, he said softly. You didn't have to. Neither did you, she replied with a smile, echoing their words. From the day before, they sat in silence for a few moments, eating quietly. Outside, the courtroom buzz was already beginning to grow. Reporters were setting up. Cameras were rolling. Hashtags had started trending online. Hashtag janitor justice and hashtag IST with Sundar. Fueled by the leaked recording that had spread like wildfire overnight, Richard Bryant was now under public scrutiny. The district attorney's office had launched an internal review, and though the judge hadn't yet ruled the trial inadmissible, the energy in the courtroom had shifted. As they finished breakfast, Marcela leaned back and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you stand up for a while?" "I mean, really, not the official version." "The real reason." Sundar looked down at his hands, then back at her. "Because he reminded me of someone." "Who?" "My father." Marcela blinked. He was an electrical engineer in India, Sundar said, voice low, steady, worked long hours, never complained. He taught me about integrity, not with words, but with actions. He used to give up his bus seat to elderly passengers even after 10-hour shifts. He taught me to respect people, no matter their job, their title, or their clothes. He paused, double quotes, Raphael, The way he carried himself. The way he helped others quietly, expecting nothing in return. It brought my father back to life for a moment. Marcela nodded slowly. I understand. A knock came at the door. Elena, the clerk, peeked in. They're ready to begin, she said. But there's something else. Sundar and Marcela exchanged a glance. There's someone waiting. Outside, Elena continued. He says he's Rafal's brother. The name alone brought a pause to the room. Sundar stood immediately. Bring him in. A tall man entered the room moments later, dressed in a faded gray jacket and jeans. His eyes were red, his posture nervous. Mr. Pichai, he said, holding out a hand. My name is Enrique. I'm Raphael's older brother. I came to say thank you. Sundar shook his hand warmly. How is Raphael? Enrique's face darkened. He's not well. He had a stroke last month. Minor, but the doctors say he needs rest. He saw the trial on TV. He saw Marcela speak. It gave him strength. Marcela stepped forward, hand over. Her heart. Poor Rafa. He said to tell you he never forgot what you did, Enrique added, and that you were the only person who treated him like a human being when no one else would. Sundar swallowed hard. Thank you for coming, he said. It means a lot. There's more, Enrique said. I brought something. He pulled a worn, folded letter from his jacket pocket. Raphael wrote this months ago. After he was fired, he never sent it. He said it was pointless. But now I think you should read it. Sundar carefully unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky but strong. Dear Pichai, you probably won't remember me. I was just the janitor who worked nights on floor 6. But I remember you. You shook my hand one evening and asked me how my daughter was doing. No one had ever asked me that before. When I got fired, I didn't cry because I lost a job. I cried because I thought dignity was something only people in suits got to have, but then you showed up. You changed that. Maybe I'll never work at Google again. Maybe no one will. But I'll never forget what you did. Thank you for seeing me. Raphael Torres tears welled in Sundar's eyes. Even Marcela wiped her face gently. Outside. The bailiff called out. Court is now in session. Sundar handed the letter to Elena. Can this be added as evidence? Absolutely, she said, her voice steady, but her eyes wet. Back inside. The judge entered. The room filled. This time, people came not just to watch, but to witness something rare. Justice not for the powerful, but for the forgotten. As the trial resumed, Richard Bryant returned with a visibly smaller team. The district attorney had pulled some of his support. He looked thinner, paler, and avoided the media entirely. Mr. Bryant, the judge began. Before we continue, I must address yesterday's recording. It was reviewed by the ethics board. This morning, due to the clear violation of prosecutorial conduct, your team has been formally reprimanded and placed under internal investigation. You may remain on the case, but any further misconduct will result in a mistrial. Richard barely nodded, rage buried under layers of shame. Then the judge turned to Sundar. Mr. Pichai, do you still wish to proceed without legal representation? I do, Your Honor, he replied, rising slowly. Very well. Please take the stand. As he walked to the witness stand, there was no shuffle of papers, no legal jargon. Just a man, standing alone, with the weight of thousands of unheard voices on his shoulders. Mr. Pichai, the judge said, in your own words, explain to this court why you intervened in the firing of Mr. Raphael Torres. Sundar looked across. The courtroom, at the jury, at Marcela, at Enrique. And then he spoke, not with anger, not with defense, but with truth. Because he mattered, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was sacred. Asterisk the testimony that shook the system. Courtroom was so silent, even the soft ticking of the judge's antique wall clock felt like thunder. Sundar Pichai sat on the witness stand, surrounded by wood-paneled walls that had seen decades of trials, yet somehow none quite like this one. No capital crime, no corporate scandal, but something deeper, a moral trial of dignity, of humanity, of how far one man would go to defend someone the world called just a janitor. The judge nodded slightly. You may proceed. Sundar folded his hands in his lap and took a quiet breath. Not to gather courage. He already had that. But to slow down his racing heart, because what he was about to say had lived in him for years. It wasn't strategic. It was truth. I grew up in a 2-room apartment in Chennai. He began slowly. My father worked as an electrical engineer. My mother as a stenographer. We had no refrigerator, no phone. I used to walk miles just to make a call from a payphone so my father could confirm his appointments. We didn't have much, but we had something that can't be bought. Values. He glanced at the jury, 12 ordinary people, now leaning forward. My parents taught me to look people in the eye when speaking to them. To treat the cleaner the same way I would treat the president. They said if I ever lost my ability. To see worth in every human being, no amount of success would make me rich. His voice remained steady, but it pulled at every corner of the courtroom. Rafael Torres didn't know I was the CEO when he saw me standing in the hallway. He just said, "Hey there, you're new here? Need directions." And when I said, "No," he still walked me to the conference room anyway. Not because he had to, but because that's who he was. A soft murmur rippled through the audience. Later, I found out he'd been working there for over a decade. Never late, never once complained. Even worked double shifts when the cleaning team was short-staffed. He never asked for recognition. And when he got fired for what they called image violations, do you know what he did? Sundar looked. Toward the prosecution, he apologized for being himself, for wearing old shoes, for carrying a patched-up backpack. He apologized for not looking executive enough, and I knew right then something was broken, not in him, but in us. The judge interjected gently. "Mr. Pichai, please remember to keep your remarks connected to the legal argument at hand." Sundar nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." He turned back to the jury. The plaintiff's claim. I breached policy by reinstating an employee without following layers of protocol. But here's what's not in your file. That employee story. His character. His impact. We have so many systems in place to protect money, strategy, and assets, but too few to protect people. The decision I made wasn't about overstepping policy. It was about correcting an injustice. He leaned in, just slightly. And if doing that puts me on trial, then so be it. A hushed silence swept the room. Even Richard Bryant, now stripped of his early arrogance, avoided eye contact. The judge nodded once again. "Thank you, Mr. Pichai. Prosecution, your witness." Richard stood slowly, gripping the lectern. His hands were tight on the wood, knuckles pale. He tried to appear calm, but his voice trembled as he began. "Mr. Pichai, you speak of values, of justice. But you're also the head of one of the largest corporations in the world. Aren't your emotions clouding your judgment? Do you truly believe one janitor deserves to outweigh years of corporate protocol?" Sundar tilted his head. "You ask that as if they're mutually exclusive. They're not. Protocols matter, but they must serve people, not the other way around. When systems begin to punish people for simply being who they are, then those systems need to be questioned." So, Richard pressed, "You believe you're above policy?" "No," Sundar answered simply. "I believe policy should never be above people." The audience erupted into murmurs again. The judge banged her gavel. "Order." Richard's tone sharpened. "Mr. Pichai, are you aware that the board reported a temporary stock dip after your decision to override the firing?" "Yes." "And you don't consider that reckless?" "I consider it a cost worth paying for doing what's right." The words landed like bricks, And what about the precedent you set? Richard barked. What if every executive started making decisions based on personal feelings? Sundar stayed calm. Then I hope more decisions will be rooted in empathy. Richard's mouth twitched. He looked like a man who had run out of ammunition, but refused to surrender. No further questions, he said, stepping back abruptly. As Sundar walked down from the stand, Marcela touched his arm briefly. You spoke for all of us, she whispered. He nodded once. He gave me the courage to. Then something unexpected happened. The judge cleared her throat and looked at the court clerk. We've received a late request for testimony, she announced. A witness who has not yet spoken but has been involved peripherally in this case. Sundar blinked. Marcela leaned in. Who? The courtroom doors opened, and in walked Mr. Eugene Parker, the building manager who had fired Raphael. An older man, with a sharp gray suit, shiny black shoes, and a stiff jaw. He walked slowly, deliberately, like a man summoned by conscience more than obligation. Mr. Parker, you understand you're not required to testify? The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor. But I want to... The room quieted again. Eugene stepped into the witness box, sat down, and took a long breath. I fired Raphael, he began, looking straight ahead. I didn't do it because he was bad at his job. He wasn't. He was one of the best. I fired him because someone on my team told me he wasn't presentable. They said it made our office look less professional. And I was trying to impress the regional director who was visiting that week. He paused, guilt settling in his shoulders. I didn't even talk to Raphael. I didn't ask. I just signed a termination form. And when Sundar reinstated him, I was furious. Not because he did the wrong thing, but because he made me see how badly I'd failed. He turned and looked directly at Sundar. You humbled me, and you were right. Then Eugene turned to the judge. If anyone's guilty of breaching values here, it's me. A stunned silence took over. The judge leaned back. Thank you, Mr. Parker. Your statement has been noted. Outside the courthouse, newsvans were already lining up. Headlines were being written. The internet buzzed with video clips of Sundar's testimony, Marcela's speech, and now Parker's confession. But inside the courtroom, something greater was unfolding. Something the law books rarely documented. A shift. One juror, a middle-aged woman in a burgundy coat, wiped her eyes. Another, a young man with dreadlocks, nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. The judge looked down at her notes, then up at the room. This trial will resume tomorrow for closing arguments. But let it be known, today something important was said here, not just about law, but about leadership. As people began to leave, Richard slumped in his seat. Marcela gathered her things. Elena held the door open. And Sundar walked out not with pride, but peace. Outside. As the evening chill returned to the air, he looked up at the courthouse pillars and whispered to himself, this was never just about me. And as he stepped down those wide stone stairs, Marcela beside him, a young woman from the crowd, shouted, You didn't just defend a janitor, Sundar. You defended all of us. And this time, the applause wasn't for power. It was for truth. Asterisk. The weight of silence, Seth. Sky above the courthouse was a heavy shade of ash. And the breeze had turned cold overnight, as if the city itself braced for what was coming next. The fifth day of the trial carried a strange tension. Not chaos. Not noise, but something quieter, heavier. The kind of silence that hangs over a room before a verdict is read, or a truth is revealed that can't be taken back. Inside the courtroom, everything felt different now. The jurors had changed. The spectators had changed. Even the judge seemed to hold her gavel with more care, as if recognizing that what was unfolding wasn't just about Sundar Pichai's decision, but about an entire system that had long favored silence over justice. Sundar sat alone again, at the defense table. There was no expensive lawyer beside him, no team of advisors or bodyguards, just a man in a plain suit with a mind full of memories and a heart that refused to be hardened. Next to him, Marcela sat in the audience, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her janitor uniform freshly pressed. Across the room, Richard Bryant, the once boastful prosecutor, now looked like a man trying to hang on to a story that was slipping through his fingers. Today was for closing arguments, but before the trial resumed, Sundar stepped outside for a moment. He walked through the courthouse hallway, nodding at the officers who had begun to smile at him with respect they hadn't shown earlier in the week. He stopped at a bulletin board lined with old court memos and outdated posters about community outreach. There was a photograph pinned near the corner, a group shot of courthouse janitorial staff from 5 years ago. In the back corner stood Rafael Torres, younger, smiling, holding a mop like it was a trophy. Beside him stood Marcela. And beside her, someone Sundar didn't recognize at first glance. It took a few seconds, but then it hit him, the man. It was Mr. Eugene Parker, the same manager who had confessed on the stand the day before. Even in that old photo, the hierarchy was visible. Rafael and Marcela stood at the edge, barely lit by the camera flash. Parker stood tall in the center, sharply, dressed, holding a clipboard. The same hands that once signed away Rafael's job with a careless stroke. Sundar touched the edge of the photo gently, then turned away. Back in the courtroom. The judge entered promptly at 9 a.m. sharp. She glanced at the clock, then at both. Tables. Double quotes, Mr. Pichai, she said softly. You may begin your closing statement. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, and walked to the center of the room. No podium, no index cards, no rehearsed speech. Just truth. Thank you, Your Honor, he began, his voice clear but low. And thank you to this jury for your time, your patience, and your willingness to listen, not just to the case, but to the people behind it. He looked at them one by one. This trial, it started as a question of whether I broke protocol, whether I used my position to reverse a decision that had already been made. And I'll be honest, yes, I did. I read the report about Rafael. I saw that it followed every step the manual required. And still, I couldn't ignore what it missed. He took a step forward. It missed the man. It missed his story. It missed the quiet sacrifices. The nights he worked when no one else would. The times he stayed late to help a sick colleague. The days he showed up even when his own child was sick at home because he couldn't afford to miss a paycheck. His voice trembled just slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of holding back too much for too long. Rafael didn't lose his job because he broke rules. He lost it because someone decided he didn't look the part. And that's not a protocol failure. That's a heart failure. The jury leaned in. Even the judge's eyes softened. I've been celebrated around the world, Sundar continued. Interviewed, praised, awarded. But the thing I'm proudest of is not the speeches I've given or the numbers I've reached. It's the moments when I saw someone being treated unfairly and did something about it. He turned to face. The audience behind him filled with janitors, clerks, interns, students, and people who looked nothing like executives, because dignity isn't reserved for the powerful. Respect shouldn't be a luxury. And if a CEO can't defend the people who clean his office floors, then what exactly is he leading? His voice cracked now. He didn't try to hide it. They want you to believe this case is about a single decision. But it's about a culture. One that asks us to ignore suffering in the name of order. One that teaches us to prioritize rules over what's right. I stood up for Rafael because I could. And because no one else did. He placed a folded piece of paper on the desk, Rafael's letter. And even if I walk out of here with nothing, I'll walk out knowing I did the right thing. He bowed his head slightly and returned to his seat. There was no applause. No outburst. Just silence. A silence so complete. It became sacred. Then Richard Bryant stood, clinging to the last threads of a case that had already unraveled. He tried. He really did. He talked about corporate governance, about executive accountability, about the danger of letting emotions interfere with company structure. But it didn't matter anymore. He sounded rehearsed, cold, detached, like a man arguing from a textbook in a room full of lived experience. Even he seemed to feel it halfway. Through his closing, he paused, lowered his voice, and said, Maybe we lost the room the moment the janitor spoke. And in that moment, even he seemed human. The judge called for a brief recess before the jury would begin deliberations. The room emptied slowly, people whispering not about legal terms, but about dignity, about fairness, about the invisible workers who suddenly became the heartbeat of the entire trial. Outside, the crowd had doubled. Signs began appearing. Justice for janitors. Lead with heart. Thank you, Sundar. But Sundar didn't smile. He sat under a small tree. Beside the courthouse wall, alone, eyes on the ground. Marcela found him there. You okay? She asked. He looked up. I don't know. You did what you had to do. Yes, he said softly. But what if it's still not enough? Marcela sat beside him, pulled out a small cloth bag, and handed it to him. Inside was a small, neatly folded white cloth. Old, worn. Raphael used to carry that with him every day, she said. He called it his lucky handkerchief. He gave it to me the day he got fired. Said maybe I could give it to someone who needed luck more than him. Sundar looked at the cloth, then clutched it quietly. Thank you. They sat there under the tree, while the world waited. And somewhere deep inside the courthouse, 12 people sat in a room, each holding the weight of one of the most quietly powerful cases they'd ever witnessed. This was no longer a question of protocol. It was a question of conscience. And they knew it. Asterisk, the verdict heard around the world. Courtroom was quiet. Not tense, not nervous, just quiet. Like the moment before sunrise when the world stands still, waiting for light. Jurors had been gone for nearly 4 hours. No one moved. No one left. Even the reporters had stopped typing, their fingers resting motionless on their keys, as if afraid the sound of clacking might disturb the sacred moment everyone now found themselves in. Sundar Pichai sat still at the defense table, Raphael's folded handkerchief held gently in his hand. It had a faded blue border and a small, almost invisible patch sewn in one corner. It wasn't just fabric anymore. It was history. A reminder of the man this whole case was really about. A man who hadn't come to court, but whose presence had filled every inch of the room. Across the aisle, Richard Bryant looked smaller than he had when the trial began. The weight of his ambition had crumbled under the truth. He tapped a pen, nervously, against his notes as if trying to pretend he still believed he had a chance. But his eyes said otherwise. In the gallery, Marcela sat with her hands folded, a small rosary wound around her fingers. She didn't pray aloud. She didn't bow her head. She just closed her eyes, remembering the hundreds of floors she had mopped, the nights she'd cried silently into her uniform, and the one man who had ever looked her in the eye and thanked her sincerely for her work. Then the door opened. The bailiff stepped forward. All rise. The jury has reached a verdict. Chairs scraped softly as everyone stood. The judge entered, her black robe flowing, her eyes steady, her face unreadable. The 12 jurors filed in like shadows, one by one, their expressions a blur of emotion. Some looked tired. Some looked thoughtful. One had red eyes, as if they'd been crying. The judge nodded toward the foreperson. A woman in her 50s with silver hair and calm strength in her jaw. Madam foreperson, the judge said, has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. Please present. The woman stood, holding a thin white paper that trembled only slightly in her hand. On the matter of executive misconduct and breach of corporate protocol by Sundar Pichai, we, the jury, find the defendant, a breath caught in every throat, not liable. The room didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It exhaled as if the entire building had been holding its breath for 6 days straight. And now, finally, it could breathe again. Sundar didn't move at first. He just sat there staring at the foreperson, absorbing the words. Not because he doubted them, but because, for the first time in a long time, something he had done from the heart had been heard. Understood and protected. The judge raised her gavel, then paused. I want to add, she said softly, that this court has not only heard the arguments of law, but witnessed something rare, act of moral courage. While protocol guides us, humanity defines us. you reminded this courtroom of that truth. With a final tap, she adjourned the session.